The smoke from Uncle Jim's grill drifted across the backyard, mixing barbecue sauce with the scent of freshly cut grass. 4th of July in suburban Phoenix meant one thing in the Martinez family. Everyone gathered at the big house on Maple Street, where my grandfather had built his legacy and my cousins now counted their blessings. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I stood near the edge of the patio, holding a sweating beer bottle, and watching my brother Danny work the crowd like he was running for mayor. Designer polo shirt, perfectly styled hair, that confident grin he'd perfected since high school. He was telling some animated story about his latest real estate flip, gesturing with his hands while our cousins hung on every word. And then I told the buyer, "Look, this property is going to triple in value within 5 years. Boom. Sold for $40,000 over asking." Danny's voice carried across the yard, making sure everyone could hear how successful he was. My name is Marcus, and I was 32 years old, standing in the shadow of my family's expectations with nothing but a backpack full of regrets and a checking account that hadn't seen 4 digits in months. Aunt Rosa appeared beside me, balancing a paper plate loaded with potato salad. "Marcus, sweetheart, how's the job search going?" Her voice carried that particular brand of family sympathy that felt more like pity. "Still looking," I said, keeping my voice steady. It wasn't technically a lie. I had been looking, just not for the kind of jobs they expected. "Well, don't worry. Something will turn up. Maybe Danny can help you get into real estate. He's doing so well." She patted my shoulder before drifting away to refill the chip bowls. That's when Danny noticed me standing alone. He excused himself from his audience and walked over, that same grin plastered across his face. But his eyes held something different, something sharper. "Little brother, there you are, hiding in the corner." He threw his arm around my shoulders with just enough force to make it feel possessive rather than affectionate. "Come on, join the conversation. We were just talking about investments." He guided me toward the group, and I felt every pair of eyes turn toward us. My cousin Jennifer was there with her husband Mark, both of them successful lawyers. My cousin, Steve, had just bought his 3rd rental property. Even my youngest cousin Ashley, fresh out of college, was already making 6 figures at a tech startup. "Marcus here is between opportunities right now," Danny announced, like he was introducing a charity case. "But hey, we've all been there, right?" The group nodded politely, but I could see the questions in their faces. How had the Martinez brothers turned out so differently? Danny with his $1 million properties and luxury car, and me with my secondhand clothes and expired job certifications. "What kind of work are you looking for?" Jennifer asked, and I could tell she was genuinely trying to be helpful. Before I could answer, Danny jumped in. "Marcus has been exploring his options, taking his time to figure things out." He said it with a laugh that was supposed to sound supportive but landed somewhere between condescending and embarrassed. "That's smart," Mark nodded. "The job market is tough right now." "Actually," I started, but Danny cut me off again. "The thing is, Marcus has always been the dreamer in the family. Remember when he wanted to be a musician? Then it was photography. Now it's—" He paused, realizing he didn't actually know what I was doing with my time. "What is it now, Marcus?" The silence stretched uncomfortably. I could feel my face getting hot, not from the Arizona sun, but from the familiar burn of family humiliation. They were all looking at me with those expressions I'd seen 1,000 times before. The look that said, "Poor Marcus, still hasn't figured it out." "I'm working on some projects," I said quietly. "Projects?" Danny repeated the word like it tasted sour. "Right. Well, projects don't pay the bills, do they?" Steve shifted uncomfortably. "Come on, Danny. Give the guy a break." But Danny was just getting warmed up. He'd had a few beers, and success had made him bold. "I'm just saying, at some point you have to stop calling them projects and start calling them hobbies." I mean, when was the last time you actually made money from one of these projects? The question hung in the air like smoke. I stared down at my beer, watching the condensation drip onto my worn sneakers. The same sneakers I'd had for 3 years because I couldn't afford new ones. Look, I'm not trying to be harsh, Danny continued, his voice getting louder. But we're not kids anymore, Marcus. We're in our 30s. I've got 2 houses, a boat, and enough money in my investment accounts to retire early if I want to. And you're still, he gestured vaguely at me, still figuring it out. Jennifer looked mortified. Danny, that's enough. No, it's not enough. Someone needs to say it. Danny was fully committed now, playing to his audience. Marcus, you're broke. Actually broke. When was the last time you picked up a dinner check? When was the last time you bought anyone a drink? Hell, when was the last time you could afford to fill up your own gas tank? The words hit like physical blows. Because he wasn't wrong. I was broke. I had been living paycheck to paycheck from odd jobs and freelance work for months. I shared a studio apartment with a roommate who was never there because he couldn't stand how small the place was. I ate ramen noodles 4 nights a week and had gotten good at making excuses for why I couldn't join family dinners at expensive restaurants. I'm just worried about you, little brother. Danny's voice softened slightly, but the damage was done. Maybe it's time to get serious. Apply for some real jobs. Stop chasing these pipe dreams and join the rest of us in the real world. The group had gone completely quiet. Even the kids playing in the pool seemed to sense the tension. Uncle Jim kept flipping burgers like nothing was happening, but I could see him listening from the grill. That's when my phone rang. The sound cut through the awkward silence like a knife. I pulled it out of my pocket, and everyone watched as I looked at the screen. The caller ID read Peterson and Associates, Accounting. Sorry, I need to take this, I said, stepping away from the group. Marcus? The voice on the other end was crisp and professional. This is Sarah Peterson. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time. I walked further into the yard, away from the patio and the curious stares. No, it's fine. What's going on? I have some news about your stock options. The acquisition went through this morning, and the final numbers are in. Are you somewhere private where we can talk? I glanced back at the group. Danny was already launching into another story, probably about how he'd handled his little brothers. Embarrassing moment with grace and maturity. But I could see Jennifer and Mark whispering to each other, and Ashley was pretending to check her phone while obviously straining to hear my conversation. I can talk, I said. Excellent. Marcus, I want you to sit down if you can. There was something in her voice that made my heart start beating faster. I'd been waiting for this call for weeks, ever since the rumors started circulating about the acquisition. But I'd tried not to get my hopes up. In my experience, good. News was usually followed by a but that made it not so good anymore. I'm sitting, I lied, leaning against the fence that separated my uncle's yard from his neighbor's. The buyout price was higher than anyone expected, significantly higher. Your 2,000 shares at the original strike price of 50 cents per share, with the acquisition price at $847 per share? I stopped breathing. Marcus, are you there? I'm here, I managed. After taxes and fees, your net payout will be approximately $1.2 million. The funds will be transferred to your account within 48 hours. The phone almost slipped from my hand. I pressed it harder against my ear, sure that I had misheard. Did you say? $1.2 million, yes. Congratulations, Marcus. I know you've been patient through this whole process. Patient. That was one way to put it. I'd been broke, desperate, and living on credit card advances while I waited for news about the startup I'd joined 18 months ago. The same startup my family had mocked me for joining instead of getting a real job. There are some documents you'll need to sign, and we should discuss your tax strategy going forward. When would be a good time to meet? I was staring across the yard at Danny, who was now demonstrating his golf swing to an impressed audience. The same Danny who had just finished explaining to everyone how broke and pathetic his little brother was. "How about Monday morning?" I heard myself say. "Perfect. I'll email you the details. And Marcus? This changes everything for you. Make sure you take some time to process this before you make any major decisions." The call ended, and I stood there, holding my phone, feeling like the world had shifted on its axis. Around me, the barbecue continued exactly as it had before. Kids splashing in the pool, adults talking and laughing over paper plates loaded with hamburgers and corn on the cob. The smell of charcoal and lighter fluid, mixing with sunscreen and chlorine. But everything was different now. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. I walked back toward the group slowly, my mind spinning. $1.2 million. The number felt impossible, like something from a movie or a lottery commercial. But Sarah Peterson was the most competent accountant I'd ever met, and she didn't make mistakes about numbers. Danny was in the middle of explaining his strategy for flipping houses when he noticed me approaching. "Everything okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Work call," I said simply. "Work?" Danny's eyebrows went up. "I thought you were between jobs." "It's complicated." Jennifer was watching me closely. She had good instincts about people, probably from years of reading clients and juries. "Good news, I hope." I looked around the circle of faces. My family, people who had known me since I was born, who had watched me stumble through my 20s, who had just witnessed my brother systematically tear down what little dignity I had left. "Yeah," I said quietly. "Good news." Danny clapped me on the shoulder. "See? I told you something would work out. What kind of work is it?" For a moment, I considered telling them. Right there, in front of the grill and the pool and the red, white, and blue decorations hanging from the patio umbrella. I imagined the looks on their faces when I explained that the project they'd all dismissed had just made me a millionaire. Instead, I smiled and took a sip of my beer. Like I said, it's complicated. The conversation moved on to other topics, but I noticed Jennifer still watching me with curious eyes. And when Aunt Rosa came around offering seconds on dessert, she squeezed my arm and whispered, "You look different. Mijo. Happier." I was different. In the span of a 5-minute phone call, I had gone from being the family failure to being worth more than most of them combined. But they didn't know that yet. And for now, I was content to let them keep thinking exactly what they'd always thought about Marcus Martinez, the dreamer who couldn't get his act together. The sun was starting to set over the Phoenix Mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Someone had turned on music, and a few of the younger cousins were dancing on the patio. Danny was deep in conversation with Uncle Jim about interest rates and market trends. I finished my beer and quietly made my way toward the house, planning to say my goodbyes and head home. I had a lot to think about, and suddenly I needed to be alone with the magnitude of what had just happened. But as I reached the sliding door, I heard Danny's voice carry across the yard one more time. "Poor Marcus," he was saying to Steve. "I really hope he figures it out soon. It's hard watching your little brother struggle like that." I paused with my hand on the door handle. Poor Marcus. If only he knew. If only any of them knew. The drive back to my studio apartment in Tempe gave me 45 minutes to process what had just happened. The Phoenix freeway stretched ahead of me, dotted with Saturday evening traffic, while the numbers from Sarah Peterson's call played on repeat in my head. $1.2 million. After 18 months of scraping by, eating dollar menu meals, and avoiding my family's disappointed looks, my apartment complex was one of those generic beige buildings that dotted the Arizona landscape like concrete tumbleweeds. 4 stories of identical units housing college students, recent graduates, and people like me who were supposedly figuring their lives out. I parked my 2007 Honda Civic next to a BMW that belonged to some kid whose parents were paying his rent and climbed the external stairs to Unit 3B. The door stuck like it always did, requiring a specific combination of lifting and pushing that I'd mastered after 8 months of living there. Inside, my roommate Trevor's absence was marked by the pristine condition of his half of the room. Military corners on his bed, desk organized with the precision of someone who spent most of his time at his girlfriend's place to avoid the cramped quarters we shared. I sat on my bed, which doubled as my couch and office chair, and stared at my laptop screen. The email from Sarah Peterson was already there, marked with the high-priority flag that made my stomach flutter with nervous energy. Financial documents, tax implications, wire transfer authorizations, legal language that transformed an impossible dream into bureaucratic reality. But to understand how I'd gotten here, to really understand why that phone call meant everything, I needed to go back to where it all started. Back to when the Martinez family still believed in me, before I became the cautionary tale they whispered about at gatherings. My father, Roberto Martinez, had been a mechanic his entire adult life. Worked at the same shop in Central Phoenix for 23 years, coming home every evening with grease under his fingernails and stories about the cars he'd brought back to life. He never made much money, but he understood machines in a way that bordered on mystical, could diagnose engine problems by sound alone, could feel what was wrong in a transmission just by driving around the block. Marcus, he used to tell me, when I was 12 years old and spending summers at the shop, everything works on principles. You just have to understand the principles, and then you can fix anything. I learned about principles watching him work, how patience was more valuable than force, how the right tool for the job was worth twice as much as raw effort, how taking something apart carefully meant you could put it back together stronger than before. My mother, Elena, cleaned office buildings downtown, started her shifts at 10 p.m. and finished at 6 a.m., coming home as Danny and I were getting ready for school. She'd make us breakfast with tired eyes and hands that smelled like industrial cleaners, always asking about homework and friends and whether we were being good boys. Education, she would say in her careful English, still accented after 30, years in Arizona, is the only thing they can't take away from you. Both of them had sacrificed everything for Danny and me to have opportunities they'd never had. Dad worked overtime to pay for our school supplies and sports equipment. Mom took extra cleaning contracts to afford our school clothes and field trip fees. They never complained, never made us feel guilty for wanting more than they'd been able to achieve. Danny had always been the obvious success story. Confident from birth, popular in school, naturally gifted at sports and social situations. By high school, he was class president, starting quarterback and dating the homecoming queen. He earned a partial football scholarship to Arizona State, studied business, and slid seamlessly into real estate right after graduation. Everyone expected great things from Danny, and he delivered exactly what they expected. I was different. Quieter, more curious about how things worked than about how to work a room. While Danny was throwing touchdown passes, I was building computers from spare parts and teaching myself programming languages from library books. While he was networking at fraternity parties, I was staying up all night learning about emerging technologies and startup companies. The family never quite knew what to make of me. When I graduated high school with a 4.2 GPA and perfect SAT scores, they celebrated. When I got a full academic scholarship to MIT, they threw a party that lasted until 2 a.m. But when I decided to study computer science instead of something more traditional like engineering or business, I saw the first flickers of doubt in their eyes. MIT was a revelation. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who thought like I did. People who got excited about algorithms and artificial intelligence and the possibilities of technology to change everything. My professors weren't just teaching from textbooks. They were working on research that would shape the next decade of human progress. I thrived academically, but I struggled socially. The other students came from families who understood what MIT represented, who had connections in tech companies and investment firms. They talked casually about startups their uncles had funded or internships their parents had arranged. I was a scholarship kid from Phoenix, whose father fixed cars and whose mother cleaned buildings. During my junior year, I met Professor Sarah Chen, who was teaching a class on machine learning applications. She was brilliant, demanding, and had zero patience for students who weren't completely committed to understanding the material. But she saw something in me that even I didn't recognize yet. "Marcus," she said after class one day, "you have an intuitive understanding of complex systems that most people never develop. Have you thought about graduate school?" I hadn't thought about anything beyond getting my degree and finding a job. That would let me pay back my student loans and help my parents retire comfortably. But Professor Chen opened my eyes to possibilities I'd never considered. Research positions, startup opportunities, the chance to work on problems that didn't even have names yet. She introduced me to graduate students who were spinning their thesis research into companies. I learned about venture capital, equity compensation, and the ecosystem of risk and reward that drove technological innovation. More importantly, I learned that being smart wasn't enough. You also had to be willing to bet on yourself when no one else would. My senior year, I joined a research team working on natural language processing. We were developing algorithms that could analyze human speech patterns and predict emotional states with unprecedented accuracy. The applications were enormous: mental health screening, customer service optimization, educational assessment tools. Professor Chen encouraged 3 of us to continue the research after graduation, to form a company around the technology we'd developed. But it would mean turning down job offers from established tech companies. It would mean years of uncertainty, living on ramen noodles and hope while we tried to turn academic research into commercial success. When I called home to discuss the decision, the conversation didn't go the way I'd hoped. So instead of getting a real job with a real salary, you want to start a company that might not make any money? Danny had been visiting when I called, and I could hear the skepticism in his voice even through the phone speaker. "It's not that simple," I tried to explain. "This technology could be revolutionary. The market potential is enormous." "The market potential," Danny repeated. "Marcus, you sound like every wannabe entrepreneur I've ever met. Everyone thinks their idea is going to change the world." My father was more diplomatic but equally concerned. "Mijo, we're proud of your education, but maybe you should get some experience first. Work for an established company, learn how business really works." My mother was the only one who seemed to understand. "If you believe in it," she said quietly, "if you really believe, then you should try." But even her support came with worry. They'd sacrificed everything for my education, and now I was talking about gambling that education on something that might never work. I made the decision anyway. 3 of us formed a company called Cognivoice, working out of a shared office space in Cambridge that smelled like coffee and desperation. We lived on savings, student loans, and the occasional consulting contract that barely covered rent and equipment costs. For 6 months, we worked 16-hour days developing our core technology and trying to find investors who understood what we were building. We pitched to dozens of venture capital firms, most of whom listened politely before explaining why our idea wouldn't work, or why the market wasn't ready, or why 3 kids fresh out of college weren't the right team to execute on such an ambitious vision. The family's patience wore thin quickly. Every phone call home included questions about when I was going to get a real job. Every family gathering became an opportunity for relatives to offer advice about stability and responsibility. Danny bought his first rental property that year and never missed a chance to mention how much money he was making while I was playing startup. Then we got our break. A mid-sized healthcare company in Texas was looking for technology to help them analyze patient feedback and identify mental health risks earlier in the treatment process. Our natural language processing algorithms were exactly what they needed. The contract was worth $200,000, enough to keep us alive for another year and validate that our technology actually worked in real-world applications. More importantly, it gave us credibility with investors. Within 3 months, we'd raised a $2 million seed round from a venture capital firm in Boston. Suddenly, we weren't 3 kids playing startup anymore. We were a funded company with paying customers and a product that solved real problems. We hired our first employees, moved to a real office, and started talking to much larger potential clients. But success in the startup world is measured differently than success in traditional careers. We weren't drawing salaries yet. Every dollar went back into growing the company. I was still living like a graduate student, sharing apartments and eating instant noodles, even though the company was worth millions of dollars on paper. The family didn't understand the distinction. To them, I was still unemployed, still chasing dreams, still avoiding the responsible path that Danny had taken. When I tried to explain equity and stock options and the potential for exponential growth, their eyes glazed over. They wanted to see paychecks and benefits and a clear career trajectory. Paper money, my Uncle Jim had called it at last year's barbecue. It's not real until you can spend it. He wasn't wrong. For 18 months, I'd been living on that paper money, watching my bank account dwindle while the theoretical value of my equity grew. Every month brought new milestones for the company, new clients, new rounds of funding. But every month also brought new bills I could barely pay and new questions from family members who were starting to think I'd made a terrible mistake. 2 months ago, rumors started circulating that Tech Global, one of the largest software companies in the world, was interested in acquiring CogniVoice. Our technology had proven itself in healthcare, education, and customer service applications. Our client base was growing exponentially. Our algorithms were being used to analyze millions of conversations every day, providing insights that helped companies better understand and serve their customers. The acquisition talks moved quickly but quietly. Tech Global needed our technology to stay competitive in the artificial intelligence market, and they were willing to pay a premium to get it. For 6 weeks, I lived in a strange state of suspended reality, knowing that my life might be about to change dramatically, but unable to tell anyone about it. The paperwork was finalized that morning, just hours before I drove to Uncle Jim's house for the barbecue. Sarah Peterson's call was the first confirmation I'd received that it was really happening, that the numbers we'd been discussing in conference rooms were about to become numbers in my bank account, $1.2 million. After taxes and fees, enough money to pay off my student loans, buy my parents a house, and still have enough left over to never worry about rent or grocery bills again, all from a company that my family had dismissed as a hobby, from technology they couldn't understand, from a decision they'd all advised me not to make. I looked around my cramped studio apartment, at the folding table that served as my desk, at the air mattress that had been my bed for 8 months because I couldn't afford a real one. In 48 hours, I could afford anything I wanted. But sitting there in the fading Arizona sunlight, what I wanted most was for my parents to understand that their sacrifices had meant something, that their son hadn't wasted the opportunities they'd given him. And maybe, just maybe, I wanted Danny to realize that there were different ways to measure success. Monday morning came with the harsh reality of Arizona summer heat and the surreal knowledge that my life was about to change forever. I woke up at 5:30 a.m., not because I had to, but because I couldn't sleep. The anticipation was like electricity running through my veins, making it impossible to stay still. The meeting with Sarah Peterson was scheduled for 9 a.m. at her downtown Phoenix office. I put on my only decent shirt, a blue button-down that I'd bought for job interviews 2 years ago, and tried to look like someone who belonged in conversations about 7-figure financial transactions. The Peterson and Associates building was one of those gleaming glass towers that reflected the desert mountains and made everything around it look small and dusty by comparison. I'd driven past it 100 times, but never imagined I'd have business inside. Sarah Peterson was exactly what I'd expected from our phone conversations. Mid-40s, immaculately professional, with the kind of sharp intelligence that came from managing other people's money for 2 decades. Her office overlooked the entire Phoenix metropolitan area, from the sprawling suburbs where I'd grown up to the mountain ranges that defined the horizon. "Marcus," she said, standing to shake my hand. "Congratulations. This is a life-changing moment, and I want to make sure we handle it properly." The documents covered her conference table like a paper landscape of my future. Tax forms, investment strategies, wire transfer authorizations. Each page represented decisions that would affect the rest of my life, but also validated every sacrifice I'd made over the past 18 months. "Before we get into the details," Sarah said, settling into her chair, "I want you to understand what this means practically. You're going from being cash poor to having more liquid assets than most people accumulate in a lifetime. That's going to change how you think about money, how other people see you, and how you see yourself." I nodded, though I wasn't sure I fully grasped what she meant yet. "The wire transfer will complete by Wednesday afternoon. I strongly recommend that you don't make any major purchases or life changes for at least 30 days. Let the reality settle in. Think about your long-term goals. And for God's sake, don't tell everyone you know until you've had time to process this yourself." Too late for that last piece of advice. My family already thought they knew everything about my financial situation. The shock was going to be considerable. We spent 2 hours going through every document, every implication, every decision that needed to be made. Sarah had prepared a comprehensive financial plan that would set me up for life if I was smart about it. Conservative investments, a reasonable budget for immediate needs, strategies for minimizing tax liability over time. When I left her office, the Arizona sun felt different on my skin. Brighter somehow, more promising. I drove back to Tempe with the windows down and music playing, feeling like I was seeing the city where I'd grown up for the first time. But the real test wasn't going to be managing the money. I was going to be managing the next 2 days while I waited for the transfer to complete, knowing that everything had changed, but not being able to prove it yet. The first person I wanted to tell was my mother. I drove to my parents' house in the Y neighborhood where I'd grown up, a working-class area that had been slowly gentrifying as Phoenix expanded. The same small ranch-style home where Danny and I had shared a bedroom until he left for college. The same front yard where my father had taught me to change oil and check tire pressure. My mother was in the kitchen, preparing lunch for my father, who would be home from the shop in an hour. She looked tired, the way she always did after working the night shift, but her face lit up when she saw me walk through the door. "Marcus, what are you doing here? Shouldn't you be looking for work?" The question stung less than it used to. 2 days? Looking for work would be the last thing I needed to worry about. "Mom, I need to tell you something. But I need you to promise me you won't say anything to Dad or Danny until I'm ready." She set down the wooden spoon she'd been using to stir rice and looked at me with the expression she'd perfected over 32 years of motherhood. The look that said she could tell when something important was happening. "Sit down, mijo. What's going on?" I told her everything. About Cognivoice, about the acquisition, about the phone call during the barbecue, about the $1.2 million that would be in my bank account in 2 days. I watched her face change as she processed what I was saying, confusion giving way to disbelief, then to something that looked like pride mixed with relief. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached across the kitchen table and took my hands in hers. "All those nights," she said softly, "when I worried about you. When I wondered if we'd pushed you to take too many risks. When your father and I argued about whether we should have encouraged you to take that safe job instead." Her eyes were filling with tears, and I realized mine were too. "You never gave up," she continued, "even when we didn't understand. Even when everyone thought you were making a mistake. You kept working, kept believing in what you were building. We sat there for a while, holding hands across the same kitchen table where she'd helped me with homework 20 years ago. Where she'd packed my lunches for school and listened to my dreams about becoming a scientist or an inventor or whatever ambitious thing I wanted to be that week. "What are you going to do now?" she asked finally. "I don't know yet," Sarah Peterson says. "I should take time to think about it, not make any big decisions right away." "That's smart, but Marcus—" She squeezed my hands tighter. "Don't let this money change who you are. Don't let it make you forget where you came from or the people who love you." I promised her I wouldn't, though I wasn't entirely sure how to keep a promise like that. How do you stay the same person when everything about your circumstances changes overnight? The next 2 days were the longest of my life. I went through the motions of my normal routine, checking job boards and sending out resumes, but my heart wasn't in it. How do you write a cover letter explaining why you want a $45,000 a year job when you're about to have more money than you've ever dreamed of? I found myself walking around Phoenix, revisiting places that had shaped who I was. The library branch where I'd spent countless afternoons teaching myself programming. The coffee shop where I'd written my first business plan on napkins because I couldn't afford a laptop. The community college where I'd taken night classes to fill gaps in my technical knowledge while working part-time jobs to pay for them. Each place held memories of struggle, of small victories, of the incremental progress that had eventually led to this moment. I realized that the past 18 months hadn't just been about building a company. They'd been about building myself into someone capable of handling success. Wednesday afternoon, I was sitting in my apartment when my phone buzzed with a notification from my bank app. For a moment, I stared at the screen without opening it, knowing that whatever I saw would make everything real and irreversible. The balance displayed was $1,247,382.19. I stared at the numbers until they started to blur. $1,200,000. More money than my parents had earned in their entire working lives combined. More money than I'd thought was possible for someone like me to have. But looking at those numbers, I didn't feel the euphoria I'd expected. Instead, I felt the weight of responsibility. This wasn't just money. It was proof that all the sacrifices had been worth something. It was validation for every ramen noodle dinner, every night spent coding until sunrise, every family gathering where I'd sat quietly while others questioned my choices. More than anything, it was freedom. Freedom from the constant anxiety about rent and groceries and student loan payments. Freedom to make choices based on what I wanted to do rather than what I could afford to do. Freedom to prove to my family that there were different ways to build a successful life. That evening, I called Professor Chen at MIT to thank her for encouraging me to take the entrepreneurial path. She laughed when I told her about the acquisition, but it wasn't a surprised laugh. "Marcus, I always knew you had the technical skills to succeed, but more importantly, you had the persistence to keep working when things got difficult. That's what separates successful entrepreneurs from brilliant people who never leave their comfort zones." "I still can't believe it actually worked," I admitted. "That's because you're thinking about this as the end of something. But it's really the beginning. You're 32 years old with financial freedom and proven experience building valuable technology. The question now is what you're going to do with those advantages." She was right, of course. This wasn't the end of my story. It was the end of the chapter where I proved I could succeed despite everyone's doubts. The next chapter would be about what I did with that success. But first, I had to get through one more family gathering. Danny had texted me Tuesday night, asking if I wanted to grab dinner Friday evening. "Just the two of us," he'd said. "I feel bad about what happened at the barbecue. I want to make it right." I agreed to meet him, curious about what making it right would look like. We met at a steakhouse in Scottsdale, The kind of place Danny liked because it had valet parking and cloth napkins and prices that demonstrated how successful he was. He was already there when I arrived, wearing a suit that probably cost more than I used to spend on rent. He stood up to hug me, and I could tell he was genuinely trying to be supportive in his own way. "Marcus, I owe you an apology. I was way out of line on Saturday. I don't know what got into me." "You were drunk," I said, sitting down across from him. "People say things when they're drunk. That's no excuse. You're my little brother, and I should be supporting you, not tearing you down in front of the whole family." The server appeared to take our drink orders. Danny ordered a scotch that cost $30 per glass. I ordered a beer, partly because I liked beer, and partly because I was still adjusting to the idea that I could afford $30 glasses of scotch if I wanted them. "Look," Danny continued once we were alone again, "I know I've been giving you a hard time about the job situation, but I'm worried about you. We all are. You're smart, you're educated, you could get a good job anywhere. Instead, you're chasing these startup dreams that might never pay off. If only he knew that they already had paid off, in a way that dwarfed his real estate success. But I wasn't ready to tell him yet. Part of me wanted to savor the irony a little longer. "What if they do pay off?" I asked. "Then I'll be the first one to congratulate you. But Marcus, the odds are against you. Most startups fail. Most entrepreneurs never make real money. I just don't want to see you waste your potential on something that probably won't work." The conversation continued through dinner, with Danny offering advice about networking and conventional career paths and the importance of financial stability. He meant well, I could tell. In his mind, he was being a good big brother, trying to steer me away from mistakes that would hurt me in the long run, but sitting there, listening to him explain why my approach to life was fundamentally flawed, I felt a strange combination of amusement and sadness. Amusement because I now had concrete proof that he was wrong about almost everything. Sadness because he was so convinced that his way was the only way that he couldn't see the possibility of alternatives. When the check came, Danny reached for it immediately. "I've got this," he said. "Consider it an apology dinner." I let him pay, though I could have covered the bill without thinking about it. There would be time later to reveal how much everything had changed. For now, I was content to let him maintain his role as the successful brother taking care of the struggling one. As we walked out to the parking lot, Danny put his arm around my shoulders. "Things are going to work out for you, Marcus. I know they are. You just need to be patient and maybe adjust your expectations a little." "Maybe," I said, though I was thinking that his expectations were the ones that needed adjusting. Friday morning, my phone rang at 7 a.m. It was my father, calling, from the auto shop. "Marcus, can you come down here? I need your help with something." I drove across town to Martinez Auto Repair, the small shop where my father had worked for more than 2 decades. The building was older than I was, with bay doors that stuck, and a waiting room that smelled like coffee and motor oil. But it was where my father had supported our family, where he'd earned the respect of customers who trusted him with their most important possessions. I found him in the back office, hunched over paperwork at a desk covered with invoices and repair estimates. "What's going on, Dad?" He looked up and I could see the stress in his eyes. "The landlord wants to sell the building. The new owners are going to triple the rent starting next month. After 23 years here, I might have to close the shop." The news hit me like a physical blow. This shop was more than just my father's workplace. It was his identity, his contribution to the community, his legacy. The idea of him losing it because of financial pressures he couldn't control felt fundamentally wrong. "How much would it take to keep the shop open?" I asked. "More than I have. The new rent would be $8,000 a month, plus they want 3 months up front as a security deposit. That's $32,000 just to stay here, and I don't have that kind of money. Sitting around. $32,000. 2 days ago, that would have been an impossible amount for our family. Now, it was less than 3% of what I had in my bank account. "Dad," I said, "what if someone could help with the money?" "Who's going to help? Your brother has his own bills to pay and you—" He trailed off, realizing he was about to mention my financial situation. What if I could help? He looked at me with the expression I'd seen 1,000 times before. The gentle disappointment of a parent who loved his child too much to destroy his dreams, but who knew those dreams weren't realistic. "Marcus, mijo, I appreciate the thought. But you don't have that kind of money." Actually, I did. And for the first time since the wire transfer had completed, I knew exactly what I wanted to do with it. "Dad," I said, taking a deep breath that felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to sit down." Roberto Martinez had been standing behind his desk, sorting through invoices with the methodical precision he brought to everything in his life. But something in my voice made him stop and look at me directly. After 32 years, he could read his son's expressions better than most people could read words on a page. "Marcus, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Nothing's wrong. Everything's right. That's what I need to tell you." I pulled out my phone and opened the banking app, the screen displaying numbers that still felt surreal even after 3 days. "Dad, look at this." He put on his reading glasses, the same wire-rimmed pair he'd worn for the past decade, and squinted at the screen. I watched his face as his brain processed what he was seeing. Confusion first, then disbelief, then a slow dawning realization that made him sit down heavily in his desk chair. "Mijo, this says you have over $1 million. 1.2 million to be exact. The company I've been working on for the past 18 months? It got acquired. This is my share of the buyout." The silence in the small office was complete except for the distant sound of pneumatic tools from the main shop. My father stared at the phone screen like it might transform into something that made more sense if he looked at it long enough. "The company," he said slowly. "The startup that everyone said would never work. That's the one. The one Danny said was a waste of time?" "Yep." He handed the phone back to me and leaned back in his chair, running his hands through graying hair that was still thick despite 61 years of Arizona sun and automotive stress. "How long have you known?" "Since Saturday. I got the call during the barbecue, right after Danny finished explaining to everyone how broke and pathetic I was." A smile started to play at the corners of his mouth. "So, when he was telling everyone about your old car and your lack of success, I was already a millionaire. I just didn't know how to tell anyone yet." The smile broke free, spreading across his face like sunrise over the Sonoran desert. Then he started laughing, the deep belly laugh I remembered from childhood when something struck him as genuinely hilarious. "Your brother," he said between laughs, "spent 10 minutes explaining to the entire family why you were a failure. And the whole time I was worth more than all of them combined." He stood up and walked around the desk to pull me into the kind of hug that communicated everything words couldn't. Pride, relief, vindication, and love all wrapped up in the smell of motor oil and aftershave that had meant safety and home my entire life. "So about the shop," I said when he finally let me go. "That $32,000 isn't going to be a problem. Marcus, you can't spend your money bailing out your old man's business." "I'm not bailing anything out. I'm investing in something that matters to me. This shop put me through college. It supported our family for 23 years. It's where I learned that honest work has value, that treating people right is more important than making maximum profit." I pulled out my phone again and opened my banking app. "Besides, $32,000 is less than 3% of what I have. It's like someone with $1,000 spending $30. And this shop means more to me than any amount of money ever could." We spent the next hour going through the landlord's demands and working out the financial details. By lunchtime, I had transferred $35,000 to the shop's business account, enough to cover the security deposit, first 3 months of rent, and a small buffer for equipment updates that had been postponed due to budget constraints. "There's one condition," I told my father as we finished the paperwork. "Don't tell anyone where this money came from until I'm ready to have that conversation with the family." When will that be? I thought about Danny's condescending dinner lecture, about the years of subtle and not-so-subtle suggestions that I was wasting my potential, about the look in everyone's eyes at family gatherings when they realized I couldn't afford to contribute to group gifts or expensive restaurant meals. "Soon," I said. "Very soon." That afternoon, I drove to the nicest car dealership in Phoenix, not because I needed a new car, but because I was curious about what it felt like to shop without looking at price tags. The Honda Civic that had carried me through the lean years was still running perfectly, but I wanted to understand the psychology of having options. The salesperson, a perfectly groomed man in his 40s named Brad, looked at my casual clothes and 10-year-old car and made immediate assumptions about my budget. He steered me toward the certified pre-owned section, pointing out practical vehicles with good gas mileage and reliable maintenance records. "This Camry would be perfect for someone in your situation," he said, patting the hood of a 3-year-old sedan. "Great value, low payments, very sensible choice." I nodded politely and let him give his sales pitch, but my attention was drawn to the luxury section of the lot. Audis, BMWs, Mercedes-Benz vehicles that cost more than most people's annual salaries. "What about something over there?" I asked, pointing toward a gleaming black BMW M4. Brad's smile became strained. "Well, that's a beautiful car, but it's probably outside your price range. The MSRP on that model is $87,000. Can I drive it? Do you have financing pre-approved? Because I'd hate for you to fall in love with something that isn't realistic." I pulled out my phone and showed him my bank balance. Not to be cruel, but to watch his worldview recalibrate in real time. "I'll get the keys," he said, his tone shifting to the reverent professionalism reserved for serious buyers. The test drive was exhilarating, not because of the car's performance, but because of what it represented. Freedom from the constant calculations that had governed every purchase decision for the past 2 years. The ability to choose based on desire rather than necessity. But sitting in that $87,000 car, I found myself thinking about my father's aging pickup truck, about my mother's 2009 Toyota with the dented bumper and rattling air conditioner, about the practical wisdom they'd taught me about the difference between needing something and wanting it. I thanked Brad for his time and drove my Honda Civic home, but not before getting his business card. There would be time for new cars later, when I'd figured out how to balance my new reality with the values that had shaped who I was. That evening, I called my mother and asked if I could come over for dinner. When I arrived, both my parents were waiting with expressions that suggested they'd been discussing my revelation all afternoon. "We've been thinking," my mother said as she served homemade enchiladas that smelled like childhood and comfort, "about what this means for our family." "It means you don't have to work night shifts anymore," I said. "It means Dad doesn't have to worry about losing the shop. It means you can retire whenever you want to. Marcus," my father said carefully, "we didn't raise you to take care of us. We raised you to build your own life. You raised me to understand that family takes care of family. That success means nothing if you don't share it with the people who made it possible." We talked late into the evening about practical matters and philosophical ones, about the responsibility that comes with sudden wealth, about the importance of staying grounded, about the difference between helping family and enabling dependence. But mostly, we talked about vindication, about the years of doubt and criticism, about the family members who had questioned every decision I'd made since college, about the quiet satisfaction of being proven right in such a dramatic way. "When are you going to tell Danny?" my mother asked as I was getting ready to leave. "I'm thinking about Saturday. Aunt Carmen is having her birthday party, right? The whole family will be there." My father raised an eyebrow. "You want to tell everyone at the same time?" I want Danny to understand that the little brother he lectured about financial responsibility last week is now in a position to buy and sell everything he owns without thinking twice about it. That sounds like revenge, my mother said. Though, she was smiling. It's not revenge, it's education. Saturday arrived with the kind of desert heat that made Phoenix summers legendary. Aunt Carmen's backyard party was in full swing by the time I arrived, with the same cast of characters who had witnessed my humiliation the previous weekend. Danny was holding court near the pool, wearing designer sunglasses and a polo shirt that probably cost more than most people's monthly car payments. He was telling Uncle Jim about a new development project he was investing in, using hand gestures to illustrate the square footage and profit projections. I walked over carrying a gift bag that contained something I'd purchased that morning, a bottle of champagne that cost $300. Not because Aunt Carmen needed expensive champagne, but because I wanted to see the look on Danny's face when he realized what I'd spent on a casual gift. "Marcus," Aunt Carmen hugged me warmly. "How are you, sweetie? Any good news on the job front?" "Actually," I said, loud enough for the nearby conversation to pause, "I have some news to share with everyone." Danny turned toward me, his expression shifting from polite interest to mild concern. The last time I'd made announcements at family gatherings, it had been to tell everyone about startups and investment rounds that none of them understood or approved of. "Good news, I hope," Uncle Jim said. "Very good news." I pulled out my phone and opened the screenshots I'd prepared. Not my bank balance. That felt too personal, too much like showing off. Instead, I'd captured the Tech Global press release, announcing the acquisition, highlighting the purchase price and the technology that had made it valuable. "My company got acquired," I said simply, "by Tech Global. They bought us for $47 million. The silence was immediate and complete. Even the kids in the pool seemed to sense that something important was happening. Danny was the first to speak. $47 million? That's the total acquisition price. My share, after taxes and fees, was $1.2 million. I watched the information ripple through the group like a stone thrown into still water. Confusion, disbelief, recalculation of everything. They thought they knew about me. "When did this happen?" Jennifer asked, her lawyer instincts kicking in with questions about timing and details. "The paperwork was finalized last Monday. I got the call about it during the barbecue last weekend." Danny's face had gone through several color changes, settling on something between pale and green. "During the barbecue? You mean when you were explaining to everyone how broke and unsuccessful I was?" "Yeah, that's when my accountant called to tell me I was a millionaire." The silence stretched longer this time, broken only by the sound of water filtering through the pool system and the distant hum of air conditioning units working overtime against the desert heat. "So all those times," Uncle Jim said slowly, "when we asked about your job situation, I was building something worth $47 million. And when we suggested you get a real job, I was already making more money than most jobs pay in a lifetime." Danny finally found his voice. "Why didn't you tell us?" It was the question I'd been waiting for, the one that would let me explain everything that had been building for years. "Because you never asked what I was actually doing. You decided it was a waste of time and stopped listening. You saw my old car and my small apartment and assumed I was failing, without ever wondering if there might be reasons for those choices that had nothing to do with money." I looked around the group, making eye contact with each person who had spent the past 2 years subtly or not so subtly suggesting that my life was headed in the wrong direction. I kept driving that car because it reminded me where I came from. I lived in that apartment because every dollar I didn't spend on rent was a dollar I could invest in the company. I ate ramen noodles and worked 18-hour days because I believed in something you couldn't see. The party had essentially stopped. Other conversations had died away as people noticed the intense discussion happening near the pool. "And last weekend," I continued, looking directly at Danny, "while you were explaining to everyone why I was a disappointment, I was sitting on information that would have changed everything you thought you knew about success and failure. Danny's mouth opened and closed several times before he managed to speak. Marcus, I'm sorry. I had no idea. I know you didn't. That's exactly the point. The aftermath of my announcement was like watching dominoes fall in slow motion. For 30 seconds after I finished speaking, nobody moved. The only sounds were the pool filter humming and someone's phone buzzing with a text message that suddenly seemed utterly insignificant. Then the questions started. Marcus, Jennifer said, her legal mind immediately jumping to practical concerns. Have you talked to a financial advisor? Tax implications for something like this can be enormous. Already. Handled, I replied. I met with Peterson and Associates on Monday. Uncle Jim was shaking his head slowly, the way people do when they're trying to process information that doesn't fit their understanding of reality. $47 million for a computer program. Natural language processing technology, I corrected gently. It analyzes speech patterns to predict emotional states and behavioral outcomes. Healthcare companies use it for mental health screening. Educational institutions use it to identify students who need intervention. Customer service departments use it to route calls more effectively. As I explained the technology, I could see some family members' eyes glazing over, but others, particularly my younger cousins who had grown up with smartphones and social media, were starting to understand the scope of what I'd built. So Ashley said, when I call customer service, and they seem to know I'm frustrated before I even explain my problem? Exactly. Our algorithms analyze tone, word choice, speaking pace, even pause patterns to determine emotional state within the first 30 seconds of conversation. Danny had been silent through this exchange, but I could see his mind working, trying to reconcile the brother he'd condescended to just days ago with the person describing technology that was apparently worth millions of dollars to major corporations. How long? He finally asked. Have you been working on this? 3 years of research at MIT, then 18 months building the commercial application. 18 months. He repeated the timeline like he was solving a math problem. So when I bought my second rental property last year and you couldn't afford to split the cost of Mom's birthday dinner. I was reinvesting every dollar I made back into the company. My living expenses were minimal because every penny counted toward building something bigger. The implications were sinking in around the group. Every family gathering where they'd paid for my meals, every time someone had offered to lend me money, every concerned conversation about my lack of direction. All of it viewed through a completely different lens now. Aunt Carmen, whose birthday we were supposed to be celebrating, looked genuinely bewildered. Marcus, why didn't you tell us? We were all so worried about you. Because the worry was based on assumptions about what success looks like. You saw my old car and my small apartment, and concluded I was failing. But those were strategic choices, not symptoms of failure. But we could have supported you, my cousin Steve said. We could have helped instead of... Instead of what? Instead of suggesting I get a real job. Instead of implying I was wasting my education. Instead of treating me like family disappointment. The words came out sharper than I'd intended, but they carried the weight of 2 years of accumulated frustration. Every well-meaning suggestion that I should consider a more stable career path. Every conversation that started with concern about my future and ended with advice about being more realistic. We were trying to help, Uncle Jim said defensively. I know you were, but your help was based on the assumption that traditional career paths are the only ones that lead to real success. You couldn't see past the surface to understand what I was actually building. My mother had been quiet through most of this exchange, but now she spoke up. Marcus told me about this on Monday. He wanted to tell you all himself, when he was ready. Monday? Danny's voice cracked slightly. You've known since Monday, and you let me spend all week feeling like shit about what I said at the barbecue? You should feel like shit about what you said at the barbecue, but not because I have money now. You should feel bad because you humiliated your brother in front of the entire family without knowing anything about his actual situation. The party had effectively ended, though nobody had officially declared it over. Other guests were pretending to continue their conversations while obviously listening to our family drama unfold. Kids were still playing in the pool, blissfully unaware that the adult world was being reconfigured around them. "So, what happens now?" Ashley asked. "Are you going to quit your job?" "Oh wait, you don't have a job. Are you going to start another company?" "I don't know yet. Right now, I'm focused on helping the people who supported me when I had nothing." I looked directly at my parents, who had been standing slightly apart from the group, watching their sons navigate this new reality. Dad's shop was about to close because the landlord is tripling the rent. That's not happening anymore. Mom's been working night shifts for 10 years to help pay off the mortgage. She doesn't have to do that anymore either. The generosity was strategic as much as it was heartfelt. I wanted the family to understand that my success wasn't just about personal achievement. It was about lifting up the people who had sacrificed for me when I couldn't repay them. But I also wanted them to see the contrast between my priorities and the assumptions they'd made about what I would do with money. "You're paying off their mortgage?" Jennifer asked. "Already done. The wire transfer went through this morning." My mother's eyes filled with tears, and my father put his arm around her shoulders. They had known this was coming. We'd discussed it over dinner the night before, but hearing it announced to the family made it real in a different way. "How much was left on the mortgage?" Danny asked, though I could tell he was afraid of the answer. "Enough that they would have been making payments for another 12 years? The silence returned, but it felt different this time. Heavier, more contemplative. People were starting to understand not just the magnitude of my success, but the ways it would change everything about our family dynamics. "I need a drink," Uncle Jim announced, heading toward the kitchen. Several other family members followed him, creating small groups that were clearly going to spend the rest of the evening processing what they'd just learned. Danny lingered near the pool, staring at the water like it might contain answers to questions he was just starting to formulate. "Marcus," he said when we were relatively alone, "I need to apologize. Really apologize. Not just the surface-level sorry I gave you last week. You already apologized at dinner." That was before I understood what I was apologizing for. I thought I was sorry for being insensitive about your job search. Now I realize I was sorry for completely misunderstanding who you are and what you're capable of. I nodded, but didn't immediately respond. Part of me wanted to let him struggle with the discomfort of being so completely wrong about something he'd been confidently opinionated about. "The thing is," he continued, "I genuinely thought I was being helpful. I thought you needed guidance, needed someone to push you toward more practical choices. I know you did. That's what makes this complicated. Your intentions were good, but your execution was based on assumptions you never questioned. How do you just forgive someone for that?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been thinking about since Monday when the money became real. How do you maintain relationships with people who fundamentally misunderstood you during your most challenging period? "I don't know if forgiveness is the right word," I said finally. "I think it's more about accepting that people can only see you through the lens of their own experience. Your experience said that success looks like steady employment and conventional career progression, so when you looked at my situation, that's how you interpreted it. But I should have listened more, should have asked better questions instead of just assuming." "Yeah, you should have, but you didn't, and here we are." We stood there watching the sun set behind the mountains that ringed Phoenix, the sky turning the kind of orange and purple that made people fall in love with the desert despite its harsh realities. "What's it like?" Danny asked. "Having that? Much money, I mean. Weird. Liberating and terrifying at the same time. Like suddenly all the rules you've been playing by don't apply anymore, but you don't know what the new rules are." "Are you going to change? Like, fundamentally change who you are?" I thought about the question seriously. I hope not. But I think I'm going to change how I interact with people who make assumptions about me based on appearances. He winced, understanding that he was definitely in that category. Over the next 2 hours, the party transformed into something completely different from what Aunt Carmen had planned. Instead of casual birthday celebration conversations, people were having intense discussions about success, family dynamics, and the nature of support versus judgment. My phone started buzzing with text messages from family members who had left. Early, from my cousin Maria. "Holy shit, Marcus, I can't believe you've been sitting on this news. So proud of you." From Aunt Rosa. "Marcus, I owe you an apology for all the times I worried about your future out loud. You obviously had everything under control." From my cousin Tommy. "Dude, can you teach me about startups? I have some ideas but no clue where to start." That last message was particularly interesting. Tommy was 26, working at a marketing agency, and had always been one of the family members who seemed most skeptical of unconventional career paths. But apparently, sudden wealth had a way of making unconventional paths seem more attractive. By 9 p.m., most of the extended family had left, but Danny and I remained, sitting by the pool with our parents and Aunt Carmen, processing the evenings. Revelations. "You know what the strangest part is?" Danny said. "I spent the last 2 years thinking you needed my advice, my guidance, my financial help if things got really bad. And the whole time, you were the most successful person in our family." "Success isn't just about money," I said, though I knew the word sounded hollow given the circumstances. "No, but money gives you options. And options give you freedom. And freedom gives you the ability to help other people in ways that actually matter." He was right, of course. The $35,000 I'd transferred to save my father's shop was more helpful than a lifetime of well-intentioned advice about career choices. "What are you going to do now?" Aunt Carmen asked. "I mean long-term. You're 32 years old and financially set for life. That's not a situation most people have to navigate." "I'm thinking about starting a venture capital fund focused on entrepreneurs from working-class backgrounds, people who have great ideas but don't have the family connections or inherited wealth that makes fundraising easier." The idea had been forming in my mind since Wednesday, when the reality of my situation started to sink in. I understood the challenges of building something from nothing with minimal resources. I knew what it felt like to be dismissed because your background didn't fit investors' expectations. "So you'd be helping other people do what you did," my father said. "Helping people who are where I was 2 years ago. Smart, hardworking, building something valuable, but struggling to get taken seriously because they don't look like what investors expect entrepreneurs to look like." "That sounds like something that would make a real difference," my mother said. As we cleaned up the remnants of the party, I realized that the evening had been a success in ways I hadn't anticipated. Not because I'd gotten to prove everyone wrong, though that had been satisfying, but because it had opened up conversations about assumptions, support, and what it really means to believe in someone. Danny helped me carry folding chairs back to Aunt Carmen's garage, and as we stacked them against the wall, he said something that surprised me. "Marcus, I know I don't have any right to ask this, but I want to learn from you. About business, about building something from scratch, about having the kind of vision that can turn into millions of dollars." "Why?" "Because I've been successful. In real estate. But it's been an incremental success. Buy a property, fix it up, sell it for a profit. Repeat. But you built something that didn't exist before. Something that solved problems people didn't even know they had. That's a completely different kind of achievement." I looked at my brother, seeing something I'd never seen before. Not the confident older sibling who always had answers, but someone genuinely curious about learning something new. "Okay," I said. "But the first lesson is about listening. Really listening, not just waiting for your turn to give advice." He smiled ruefully. "Point taken." As I drove home that night, I realized that the evening had been about more than revelation or vindication. It had been about the possibility of rebuilding relationships on a foundation of actual understanding rather than assumptions. The ripple effects of my announcement would continue for weeks, maybe months. Family dynamics would shift, conversations would be different, and everyone would have to recalibrate their understanding of what success could look like. But for the first time in years, those changes felt like progress rather than conflict. The week following Aunt Carmen's birthday party felt like living in an alternate universe where everything familiar had been rearranged in subtle but significant ways. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from family members, old friends who had heard the news secondhand, and even a few former classmates who suddenly remembered we used to be close. But it was the changes in my immediate family that fascinated me most. Dynamics that had been set in stone for decades were shifting like sand dunes in a windstorm. Danny called me Tuesday morning, his voice carrying a tone I'd never heard from him before. Genuine uncertainty mixed with what sounded almost like reverence. "Marcus, I've been thinking about what you said Saturday night, about listening instead of giving advice. I want to start over. Can we have coffee? Not so I can tell you what I think you should do, but so I can actually learn about what you've already done." We met at a small cafe in Central Phoenix, the kind of place I'd discovered during my broke graduate student days, because they had free Wi-Fi and didn't rush you to leave after ordering a single cup of coffee. Danny arrived early, which was unlike him. Usually he operated on the assumption that making people wait demonstrated importance. "I've been researching your company," he said without preamble, sliding a printout across the table. "Cognivoice. I found the Tech Global press release, some articles about natural language processing, even your MIT thesis abstract." I looked down at the papers he'd assembled. Screenshots of news articles, academic papers about machine learning, a breakdown of the artificial intelligence market that he'd obviously spent hours compiling. "I have to admit," he continued, "most of it went over my head. But I'm starting to understand the scope of what you built. This wasn't just some app or website. This was fundamental research that you turned into technology that major corporations need." "You didn't have to do all this research." "Yes, I did. Because for 2 years I've been giving you advice about career choices without bothering to understand what career you'd actually chosen. That's not just ignorant. It's arrogant." The conversation continued for 3 hours. Danny asked detailed questions about everything from the technical challenges of building machine learning algorithms to the business strategy of targeting healthcare and education markets. But more importantly, he listened to the answers without immediately jumping to conclusions or suggestions. "The part that blows my mind," he said as we prepared to leave, "is the patience. You worked for 18 months without a regular paycheck, living on savings and hope, while building something that might have failed completely. It almost did fail, several times. There were months when I wasn't sure we'd be able to make payroll for our first employees. But you kept going, because the alternative was giving up on something I knew was valuable. And because every time someone told me to be more realistic, I became more determined to prove that realistic was a limited way of thinking about what's possible." Danny was quiet for a moment, processing this perspective. "I think I was one of those people telling you to be realistic. You were definitely one of those people. How do you not hate me for that?" It was a question I'd been asking myself since Saturday night. How do you maintain a relationship with someone who spent years undermining your confidence during your most challenging period? Because hating you wouldn't change anything that happened, and it would prevent anything good from happening in the future. Besides, you weren't trying to hurt me. You were trying to protect me from what you saw as inevitable disappointment. But I was wrong. Spectacularly wrong. But being wrong about something doesn't make you a bad person. It just makes you someone who learned something important about the limitations of your own perspective. That afternoon, I drove to my parents' house to check on how they were processing their new reality. I found my mother in the kitchen, surrounded by mortgage documents and bank statements, with a calculator and a yellow legal pad covered in numbers. "Mom, what are you doing?" "Trying to understand what it means that we don't have a mortgage anymore. I've been making payments for 16 years. I don't know how to think about money without that payment in the budget." I sat down beside her, at the kitchen table where I'd done homework 20 years ago, where we'd had countless family meetings about money and responsibilities and dreams. "It means you have an extra $1,147 per month to spend on things you want instead of things you owe." But what do we want? We've been focused on needs for so long, I'm not sure I remember how to think about wants. It was a profound observation, and one that revealed something about the psychology of financial stress that I was just beginning to understand. When you live paycheck to paycheck for years, you develop habits of thinking that don't automatically adjust when circumstances change. "What's something you've always wanted to do but couldn't afford?" She thought for a long moment. "Your father has always talked about taking a photography class. He loves taking pictures, but he's never had time or money for proper equipment and training. So get him equipment and sign him up for classes." "That seems frivolous." "Mom, frivolous is exactly what you can afford to be now. You spent 30 years putting everyone else's needs first. You worked night shifts to pay for Danny's football equipment and my college expenses. You've earned the right to be frivolous." We spent an hour going through a list of things my parents had postponed or dismissed as impractical over the years. A vacation to visit relatives in Mexico, a kitchen renovation that would give my mother the workspace she'd always wanted, new tools for my father's shop that would make his work easier and more efficient. By the time my father came home from work, we had created a plan for spending money on desires rather than obligations, a skill that apparently required as much learning as any other major life change. "Marcus," my father said after my mother had excitedly explained our afternoon of financial planning, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me." "Okay. Are you doing all this, paying off the mortgage, saving the shop, planning these gifts, because you love us, or because you feel guilty about keeping the money secret?" The question caught me off guard with its directness and insight. My father had always been good at cutting through complexity to reach the heart of matters. "Both," I said after considering it carefully. "I love you, and I want to share this success with the people who made it possible. But I also feel guilty that you spent 2 years worrying about money while I was sitting on information that could have relieved that worry." "Good," he said. "I was worried it was just guilt, because guilt doesn't sustain generosity. Love does." That evening, I received a call that shifted my focus from family dynamics to future opportunities. Professor Chen from MIT was on the line, her voice carrying the excitement that always accompanied her discussions of promising new research. "Marcus, I've been following the news about Cognivoice. Congratulations on a remarkable achievement. But I'm calling because I have a proposition that might interest you." She explained that MIT was launching a new entrepreneurship program designed to help working-class students turn academic research into commercial ventures. They needed someone with both technical credibility and real-world startup experience to lead the program. "The salary wouldn't be impressive by your new standards," she said with a laugh. "But the opportunity to shape the next generation of entrepreneurs from non-traditional backgrounds might be worth more than money." The offer intrigued me for reasons that went beyond professional opportunity. It would give me a chance to be the mentor I'd wished for during my own early struggles, to help other students navigate the gap between brilliant ideas and successful businesses. What kind of time commitment are we talking about? Half-time position. You'd teach 1 seminar per semester, mentor startup teams, and help design a curriculum that addresses the specific challenges faced by first-generation entrepreneurs. Let me think about it. Of course. But Marcus, I should mention that we've already had inquiries from 3 venture capital firms about partnering with the program. Apparently, your success has made investors more interested in finding the next generation of unconventional entrepreneurs. After hanging up, I realized that my success was creating opportunities not just for me, but for other people who shared my background and challenges. The ripple effects extended beyond my family to include people I'd never met who might benefit from a changed perception of what entrepreneurs could look like. Thursday brought an unexpected visitor to my apartment. I opened the door to find Uncle Jim standing in the hallway, looking uncomfortable in the way that suggested he had something important to say, but wasn't sure how to say it. "Marcus, do you have a few minutes? I'd like to talk." I invited him in. Though my studio apartment felt absurdly small when occupied by two adults having a serious conversation, Uncle Jim sat on the edge of my bed, which doubled as my couch, and looked around at the modest space that had been my home during my rise to millionaire status. "This is where you lived while you were building a multi-million-dollar company?" "This is where I live now. I haven't moved yet." "Why not?" "Because moving requires time and energy, and I'm still figuring out what I want my new life to look like. This place has been perfectly adequate for my needs." Uncle Jim shook his head slowly. "Marcus, I owe you an apology. Not just for underestimating you, but for something more specific." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "6 months ago, your aunt and I were having dinner with some friends, and your situation came up in conversation. I said some things about your career choices that I'm not proud of." He handed me the paper. It was a printout of an email he'd sent to my mother, suggesting that maybe it was time for the family to stage an intervention about my unrealistic expectations and encourage me to face reality about career prospects. Reading the email was like getting punched in the stomach. Not because Uncle Jim had been concerned about me, but because the tone carried such certainty that I was heading for failure, such confidence that my choices were obviously wrong. "Your mother never responded to this email," he continued. "At the time, I thought she was being naive, enabling your delusions. Now I understand she was protecting you from family members who thought they knew better than you did about your own life." I folded the email and handed it back to him. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because I want you to understand that the disrespect wasn't just casual comments at family gatherings. Some of us were actively trying to undermine your confidence in your choices, and I want to apologize for that specifically." Apology accepted. Just like that? Uncle Jim, holding on to anger about what people said when they didn't understand my situation, would be like carrying rocks in my pockets. It would slow me down without changing anything that already happened. He studied my face as if trying to determine whether I was being genuine or diplomatic. "How did you develop that kind of emotional maturity?" "Probably from spending 2 years listening to people tell me I was making mistakes while I was actually building something valuable. You learn to separate other people's fears from your own reality." Before he left, Uncle Jim asked one more question. "What would you tell someone who wanted to start over? Someone who realized they'd been thinking about success and risk in limited ways?" "I'd tell them that it's never too late to start listening instead of talking, and that the most dangerous assumption is thinking you already understand everything you need to know." Friday evening, I decided to take myself out to dinner at the nicest restaurant in Phoenix. Not to celebrate, but to experience what it felt like to order without looking at prices, to tip generously without calculating the impact on my budget. The maitre d' led me to a table with a view of the city lights stretching toward the mountains. I ordered dishes I'd never tried, wine that cost more than I used to spend on groceries in a week, and took my time savoring both the food and the strange luxury of unlimited choice. Halfway through dinner, my phone buzzed with a text from Danny. "Marcus, I've been thinking about our conversation earlier this week. I want to ask you something important, but I want to ask it in person. Are you free this weekend?" I texted back. "Saturday afternoon works. What's on your mind?" His response came immediately. "I want to know if you'd consider letting me invest in your next venture. Not because we're family, but because I want to learn about building something from the ground up instead of just buying and selling things that already exist." Looking out at the Phoenix skyline, I realized that my success had accomplished something I hadn't expected. It hadn't just proved that unconventional paths could lead to conventional measures of success. It had opened up conversations about what success could mean, what kinds of risks were worth taking, and what it looked like to support someone's dreams instead of limiting them. The waiter brought my check, and I left a tip that was larger than many of my grocery budgets during the lean months. As I walked to my car, I thought about Professor Chen's job offer, Danny's investment interest, and the various opportunities that were emerging from a situation that had started as simple vindication. Success, I was learning, wasn't just about proving people wrong. It was about creating possibilities for proving people right about things they'd never dared to imagine. 6 months later, I stood in the conference room of my new office space in downtown Phoenix, looking out at the Sonoran Desert Mountains while preparing for a meeting that would have been impossible to imagine a year ago. The space wasn't flashy. Exposed brick walls, polished concrete floors, and floor-to-ceiling windows that flooded the room with natural light. But it was mine. And more importantly, it represented something much bigger than personal achievement. Martinez Ventures had officially launched 3 weeks earlier with $15 million in committed capital. Half of that was my own money, reinvested from the CogniVoice acquisition. The other half came from investors who understood our mission, identifying and funding brilliant entrepreneurs from working-class backgrounds who were building solutions to problems they understood intimately. Our first portfolio company was founded by Maria Santos, a former hotel housekeeper who had developed an AI-powered scheduling system that optimized cleaning staff assignments while ensuring workers received fair wages and reasonable schedules. She'd pitched the idea to 17 traditional venture capital firms before finding us. They'd all told her the market wasn't big enough, or that someone without an MBA couldn't understand the complexities of enterprise software sales. They were wrong on both counts. Maria's system was now being used by hotel chains across the Southwest, reducing labor costs by 23% while increasing worker satisfaction scores by 41%. More importantly, she was building wealth for herself and creating better working conditions for people whose voices were rarely heard in boardrooms. The meeting I was preparing for would determine our second investment. David Kim, a former construction worker who had lost 3 fingers in an industrial accident, had spent 4 years developing wearable sensors that could predict equipment failures before they caused injuries. His technology could save lives and reduce workplace injuries by orders of magnitude. But traditional investors kept focusing on his lack of formal engineering credentials rather than his deep understanding of construction site safety. Their loss was about to become our gain. But before the meeting started, I had 20 minutes to reflect on how dramatically my life had changed since that 4th of July barbecue, where Danny had publicly dismissed my prospects. The changes weren't just financial, though those were certainly dramatic. I'd moved into a house in central Phoenix. Nothing ostentatious, but with a home office, a guest room for visiting entrepreneurs, and a backyard large enough to host the monthly dinners I'd started organizing for startup founders from non-traditional backgrounds. My parents had retired 6 months early, my father finally pursuing photography that had been a lifelong passion, my mother taking cooking classes and volunteering at a literacy center. They'd also taken their first vacation in 15 years, spending 3 weeks visiting relatives in Mexico and sending me daily photos of beaches and ancient ruins and foods they'd never tried. Danny had become one of my closest advisors, not because we were brothers, but because he'd transformed his approach to learning and growth in ways that impressed me daily. He'd sold 2 of his rental properties and invested the proceeds in 3 of our portfolio companies, saying he'd rather own small pieces of revolutionary technologies than large pieces of conventional real estate. But the most significant change was harder to quantify. I'd discovered that success measured only in personal terms was ultimately hollow. The satisfaction of proving people wrong lasted about 2 weeks. The deeper fulfillment came from using that success to expand possibilities for other people who faced similar challenges. Professor Chen's MIT program had launched in January with 12 students, each working on startups that addressed problems in their home communities. I taught a monthly seminar on translating technical innovation into business strategy, but more importantly, I served as living proof that brilliant ideas could come from anywhere, and that unconventional backgrounds could be competitive advantages, rather than obstacles. One of my students, Jennifer Reyes, had grown up in East Los Angeles and was developing educational software that taught math concepts through culturally relevant examples and bilingual instruction. Another, Marcus Washington, had been raised by his grandmother in rural Alabama and was building precision agriculture tools specifically designed for small family farms that couldn't afford enterprise-level technology. Traditional venture capital firms were starting to pay attention to our results. When your portfolio companies consistently outperform market expectations, people begin questioning their assumptions about what makes entrepreneurs successful. The phone on my desk rang, interrupting my pre-meeting reflection. It was Sarah Peterson, my accountant, calling with quarterly investment updates. Marcus, I wanted to give you a heads up about your financial position before the Kim meeting. The Cognivoice acquisition proceeds have grown to $1.47 million through conservative investments. Martinez Ventures is currently valued at $23 million based on the performance of your portfolio companies. And your personal net worth, including all assets and investments, is now approximately $2.8 million. That's significant growth. It's what happens when you make smart investments in undervalued opportunities. Your thesis about backing entrepreneurs from working-class backgrounds is proving itself in financial terms as well as social impact terms. After hanging up, I realized that the numbers, while gratifying, weren't what motivated me anymore. The real measure of success was the email I'd received that morning from Maria Santos, telling me about the scholarship fund she was establishing for children of hotel workers who wanted to study computer science, or the call from David Kim's wife, explaining how his company's first major contract had allowed them to buy their first house and start the family they'd been postponing for financial reasons, or the message from Jennifer Reyes sharing that her educational software had been adopted by 3 school districts and was already showing measurable improvements in math performance among Latino students. A knock on the conference room door pulled me back to the present. David Kim stood in the doorway, wearing his best shirt and carrying a laptop bag that had seen better days. His left hand, missing 3 fingers, gripped a folder containing patent applications and technical specifications that represented 4 years of obsessive innovation. Mr. Martinez? I'm David Kim. Thank you for taking this meeting. Please call me Marcus, and thank you for being willing to share your work with us. David's presentation was masterful, not because of polished slides or venture capital buzzwords, but because of its absolute clarity about a real problem and an elegant solution. His sensors could detect vibration patterns, temperature fluctuations, and stress indicators that preceded equipment failures by hours or days. The technology was sophisticated, but he explained it in terms that anyone who had worked with heavy machinery could understand. Most safety systems are reactive, he said, showing video of his sensors in action. They respond after something goes wrong. Our system is predictive. It tells you that something is going to go wrong, while there's still time to prevent it. What's your background in sensor technology? I asked, though I already knew the answer from his application materials. None, formally. But I spent 8 years working construction, and I learned to listen to machines the way other people listen to music. When an excavator starts making a slightly different sound, when a crane's hydraulics feel different, when concrete mixer vibrations change by a few degrees, those are signals that something's wearing out or breaking down. And traditional engineers miss those signals? They understand the theoretical principles, but they've never worked a 12-hour shift listening to equipment that might kill you if it fails. They design safety systems based on textbook failure modes, not real-world warning signs. David's personal story was compelling, but his business case was irrefutable. Construction injuries cost the industry $13 billion annually. His sensors could prevent 60% of equipment-related accidents while reducing maintenance costs through predictive scheduling. 3 construction companies were already pilot testing his technology, with results that exceeded every performance metric. "How much are you looking to raise?" I asked. $750,000 for manufacturing scale-up and sales team expansion. "What valuation?" "We're proposing a $3 million pre-money valuation." I looked across the table at my investment partner, Angela Rodriguez, who had joined Martinez Ventures after 15 years managing portfolios for traditional VC firms. She'd grown frustrated with their narrow definitions of fundable entrepreneurs and had jumped at the chance to back founders who understood problems from the inside out. Angela nodded slightly, our prearranged signal that she saw the same potential. "I did, David," I said. "We'd like to lead your Series A round, $750,000 for 20% equity, with an option to invest an additional $500,000 if you hit specific revenue milestones in the next 12 months. His face went through a series of expressions: surprise, relief, gratitude, and determination. "Are you serious?" "Completely serious. Angela will send you a term sheet by tomorrow morning. But I want to tell you why we're making this investment." I stood up and walked to the window overlooking downtown Phoenix, the city where I'd grown up thinking that success was something that happened to other people, in other places, to people with different backgrounds and better connections. 2 years ago, I was sitting in my uncle's backyard listening to my brother explain to our entire family why I was a failure. I had no money, no job prospects, and a startup that everyone assumed would never amount to anything. I turned back to face David, whose expression had shifted to intense curiosity. But I also had technology that I knew solved real problems, and the persistence to keep working on it despite everyone's skepticism. What I didn't have was anyone who understood that unconventional backgrounds can be sources of strength rather than weakness. "You're investing in my company because I'm a construction worker?" "I'm investing in your company because you're a construction worker who became an entrepreneur while staying connected to the community you came from. You understand workplace safety in ways that MIT graduates never will. You've tested your technology in real conditions with real stakes. And you're building something that will directly benefit people whose voices are rarely heard in corporate boardrooms." David was quiet for a moment, processing not just the investment offer but the philosophy behind it. "What happens next?" he asked finally. "Next, you hire the team you need to scale production. You expand pilot programs to additional construction companies. You refine the technology based on feedback from people who actually use it. And in 18 months, when larger companies want to acquire your technology, you'll be in a position to negotiate from strength. And Martinez Ventures? We'll be here every step of the way, not just as investors, but as partners who understand what it's like to build something valuable while people are betting against you." After David left, energized and clutching our preliminary investment terms, Angela and I spent an hour debriefing the meeting and planning our due diligence process. "You know," she said as we prepared to close the office for the day, 6 months ago, I thought this fund was a noble experiment that might break even if we were lucky. Now I think we're going to outperform every traditional VC fund in the region. Why? Because we're investing in people who have to succeed. David Kim isn't building sensors as an intellectual exercise. He's building them because he's seen friends get hurt by preventable accidents. Maria Santos isn't optimizing hotel schedules for fun. She's creating systems that give workers more control over their lives. Necessity drives innovation, I agreed. More than that, personal stakes drive persistence. When failure means going back to a job that might literally kill you, you tend to work harder and think more creatively than people who have safety nets. That evening, I drove to my parents' house for our weekly dinner. It had become a tradition. After my mother retired, every Friday, the extended family gathered to share meals and catch up on each other's lives. But these dinners were different from the gatherings I remembered from my childhood. The conversations were more curious, more supportive, more focused on possibilities than limitations. Danny was there with updates on his own entrepreneurial project, a construction management app he was developing with guidance from David Kim and funding from his real estate proceeds. Ashley was planning to leave her tech startup job to launch a sustainable fashion company focused on work clothes for women in traditional blue-collar jobs. Even Uncle Jim had started a photography business, combining his retirement hobby with my father's technical expertise. "It's like Marcus created a virus," my mother observed, serving homemade tamales that smelled like celebration and tradition. "Everyone catches entrepreneurship." "It's not a virus," Danny corrected. "It's permission." Marcus proved that you don't have to choose between staying connected to your roots and building something bigger than yourself. After dinner, I found myself in the backyard where this story had begun, standing near the same patio where I'd received Sarah Peterson's life-changing phone call 6 months earlier. My phone buzzed with a text message from Jennifer Reyes, my MIT student whose educational software was changing how children learned mathematics. "Marcus, I wanted you to be the first to know. We just signed our biggest contract yet, Los Angeles Unified School District. 50,000 students will be using our platform by September. None of this would have happened without your support and mentorship." I smiled and looked up at the desert sky, where stars were beginning to appear in the deepening twilight. 6 months ago, I had been focused on proving that I wasn't the failure my family thought I was. Tonight, I was surrounded by evidence that success multiplied when you shared it, rather than hoarding it. My father appeared beside me, carrying 2 bottles of beer, and the comfortable silence that came from understanding each other without needing constant conversation. "Marcus," he said finally, "I want to ask you something. Are you happy?" It was a simple question, but it deserved a thoughtful answer. "I'm something better than happy," I said. "I'm useful. I'm building things that matter with people who matter. I'm proving that success can look different than what people expect, and I'm creating opportunities for other people to prove the same thing." "Good," he said. "Happiness fades when circumstances change, but usefulness, that lasts." We stood there drinking beer and watching the lights of Phoenix spread across the valley floor. 2 generations of the Martinez family who had learned that limitations were usually assumptions in disguise, and that the most powerful victories were the ones that lifted others up while you climbed. My phone buzzed one more time. A message from Danny. "Marcus, I know I already apologized for the barbecue incident, but I want to thank you for something else. For showing me that being wrong about something important can be the beginning of being right about something even more important." I finished my beer and headed inside to rejoin my family, carrying with me the knowledge that the story that had started with public humiliation had evolved into something much more valuable. A platform for possibility, a foundation for other people's dreams, and proof that the greatest success stories are never really about individual achievement. They're about what happens when someone who climbs high enough reaches back to help others follow the same path. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.